What happens when the right to bear arms collides with the threat of government force? When does political speech cross the line from commentary into something far more dangerous? In the last 48 hours, a single statement from a right-wing commentator has ignited a firestorm that's got Second Amendment advocates, civil liberties groups, and everyday Americans asking one critical question. Are we watching the normalization of political threats in real time? Stay with me, because what I'm about to break down isn't just another headline. It's a window into how fractured our national conversation has become and why that should concern every single one of us, regardless of where we stand politically. Let me set the scene for you. Over the past week, a prominent right-wing commentator, we're talking someone with hundreds of thousands of followers across social media platforms, made a statement that's been described by critics as nothing short of a direct threat. The context, a planned gathering in Washington, D.C., where gun rights activists and Second Amendment supporters were organizing to demonstrate their constitutional rights. Here's where it gets intense. This commentator, during a live broadcast or social media post, allegedly suggested that gun owners heading to the nation's capital should be met with forceful government action. Now, the exact wording matters here, and depending on which source you're reading, the phrasing ranges from confrontational to outright threatening. Some reports indicate the commentator said these individuals should be dealt with or face consequences for bringing their weapons to a political demonstration. Let me be crystal clear about something. The First Amendment protects a lot of speech. Political commentary, even harsh criticism, falls under protected expression, but there's a line, a very specific legal line, where speech transforms from opinion into incitement, or worse, into what could be interpreted as a threat of violence or government overreach. So what exactly was said? While I don't have the verbatim quote in front of me right this second, multiple news outlets and social media watchdog groups have reported that the statement involved language suggesting that armed protesters should not be allowed to gather freely and that law enforcement or military force might be justified in stopping them. Some interpretations suggest the commentator was advocating for preemptive action against lawful gun owners simply for exercising their constitutional rights. Think about that for a second. We're not talking about individuals breaking the law. We're not discussing people threatening violence or engaging in illegal activity. We're talking about American citizens who, under the Second Amendment, have the right to keep and bear arms, and under the First Amendment, have the right to peacefully assemble and petition their government. The backlash was immediate and intense. Within hours, the statement went viral. Gun rights organizations like the National Rifle Association, Gun Owners of America, and countless grassroots Second Amendment groups began condemning the remarks. Civil liberties advocates on both the left and right raised alarms about the implications of a public figure, especially one with significant influence, calling for government force against peaceful demonstrators. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Some defenders of the commentator argued the statement was taken out of context, that it was hyperbole, or that it was simply strong political rhetoric designed to make a point about public safety and the risks of armed gatherings in sensitive areas like the nation's capital. Context matters, right? But so does impact. Now, you might be thinking, why should I care about one commentator's opinion? People say outrageous things online every single day, and you're absolutely right. They do. But this isn't just about one person's words. This is about a pattern, a disturbing trend where political discourse in America has become so polarized, so heated, that threats, veiled or otherwise, are becoming normalized. Let me break down why this specific incident matters on multiple levels. First, constitutional rights under pressure. The Second Amendment is one of the most debated provisions in the entire Constitution. Roughly 30% of American adults own guns, according to recent surveys. That's approximately 80 million people. Millions more support the right to bear arms, even if they don't personally own firearms. When a public figure suggests that exercising this constitutional right should be met with government force, it strikes at the heart of what many Americans consider fundamental liberties. But it's not just about guns. The First Amendment is equally at stake here. Peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances, these aren't suggestions. They're constitutional guarantees. When those rights are threatened, even rhetorically, it sets a dangerous precedent. Second, the escalation of political rhetoric. Over the last decade, we've watched political language become increasingly extreme. Terms like enemy of the people, traitor, insurrectionist, and threat to democracy get thrown around with alarming frequency. Both sides of the political spectrum are guilty of this, but here's the thing. Words have consequences. When influential figures with large platforms use language that dehumanizes or threatens their political opponents, it doesn't just stay in the realm of theory. It influences how millions of people think, how they perceive the other side, and in some cases, how they act. We've seen this play out in real time. Political violence in America has been on the rise. According to data from organizations that track political extremism, incidents of violence motivated by political ideology have increased significantly over the past 5 years. We're talking about everything from vandalism and harassment to actual physical attacks, and in the most extreme cases, acts of terrorism. Does rhetoric directly cause violence? That's a complex question that scholars, legal experts, and psychologists debate. But there's strong evidence that inflammatory language contributes to a climate where violence becomes more thinkable, more justifiable in the minds of those already predisposed to extreme action. Third, the question of accountability. Here's a question I want you to sit with. Should public figures be held accountable for statements that could reasonably be interpreted as threats or incitement? The legal standard is actually pretty clear. Under the Supreme Court's decision in Brandenburg versus Ohio, speech can be restricted if it is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. That's a high bar, deliberately so, to protect free speech. But what about the court of public opinion? What about platform policies? What about basic human decency and responsibility? Social media companies have terms of service that prohibit threats and incitement. YouTube, Twitter, now X, Facebook, Instagram, they all have rules against this kind of content, yet enforcement is wildly inconsistent. Some accounts get banned for relatively minor infractions, while others seem to operate with impunity despite repeated violations. This inconsistency breeds frustration and cynicism. It makes people feel like the rules don't apply equally, that there's a different standard depending on your political affiliation or the size of your audience. Fourth, the chilling effect on democratic participation. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the whole situation. When people start to believe that exercising their constitutional rights could make them targets, either of government action or public vilification, they start to self-censor. They stop speaking up, they stop assembling, they withdraw from the democratic process. This is called a chilling effect, and it's incredibly dangerous for a free society. Democracy requires active participation. It requires people to be able to express dissenting views, to gather peacefully, to advocate for their beliefs without fear of retaliation. When that breaks down, when people are afraid to exercise their rights, democracy itself is weakened. To really understand the gravity of this situation, we need to look at some historical context and real-life examples of what happens when this kind of rhetoric goes unchecked. Example 1, the rhetoric-violence connection. Throughout history, we've seen how dehumanizing language and threats against specific groups have preceded violence. I'm not going to invoke extreme examples unnecessarily, but any student of history knows that genocides, pogroms, and political purges don't happen in a vacuum. They're preceded by years, sometimes decades, of rhetoric that normalizes the idea that certain people are dangerous, that they're not really us, that they deserve whatever comes to them. Now, am I saying that one commentator's statement is going to lead to genocide? Absolutely not. That would be absurd and irresponsible. But I am saying that we need to recognize patterns early. We need to push back against the normalization of threats and dehumanization before they metastasize into something worse. Example 2, recent political violence in America. Let's bring this closer to home. Over the past few years, we've witnessed several high-profile incidents of political violence. The January 6th Capitol riot in 2021, where rhetoric about stopping the steal and fighting like hell preceded an assault on the seat of American democracy. 5 people died that day, and over 140 police officers were injured. The attack on Paul Pelosi in October 2022, where an individual motivated by conspiracy theories and political extremism broke into the home of then-Speaker Nancy Pelosi and assaulted her husband with a hammer. The increase in threats against election workers, school board members, and local officials. According to a survey by the Brennan Center for Justice, 1 in 3 election officials feel unsafe because of their job, and nearly 1 in 5 have received threats. Armed confrontations at protests and counter-protests, where the presence of weapons has escalated tensions and, in some cases, led to deadly outcomes. In each of these cases, you can trace a line from heated rhetoric to real-world violence. It's not always a straight line, and it's not always direct causation, but the connection is there. Example 3, the armed protest debate. The question of armed protests is particularly relevant here. After the 2020 protests over police brutality and racial justice and the counter-protests that followed, America has been grappling with what it means to have armed individuals at political demonstrations. In some states, open carry is legal. People have the right to bear arms in public spaces. But does that right extend to bringing weapons to politically charged gatherings where tensions are already high? This is a genuinely difficult question, and reasonable people disagree. Some argue that armed citizens at protests serve as a deterrent to violence and government overreach. They point to historical examples where armed communities have protected themselves from aggression. Others argue that the presence of weapons escalates tensions, increases the likelihood of violence, and creates an intimidating environment that suppresses free speech for those who feel threatened. Both perspectives have merit, and this is exactly the kind of nuanced conversation we should be having as a society. But that conversation can't happen productively when influential voices are making what sound like threats against people simply for exercising their rights. Example 4, government overreach concerns. There's another dimension to this story that we can't ignore, the very real concern about government overreach. American history is full of examples where the government has used force against its own citizens, often under the guise of maintaining order or national security. The Kent State shootings in 1970, where the National Guard fired on unarmed student protesters, killing 4. The Move bombing in Philadelphia in 1985, where police dropped explosives on a residential building, killing 11 people, including 5 children. The Ruby Ridge standoff in 1992 and the Waco siege in 1993, both of which ended with tragic loss of life and raised serious questions about the use of government force. More recently, the aggressive federal response to protests in Portland in 2020, where unmarked federal agents detained protesters. These examples fuel a deep distrust of government among many Americans, particularly those who identify as libertarian or conservative. The idea that a commentator would advocate for government force against peaceful gun owners taps into these historical traumas and legitimate concerns about state power. Now, let's get into the legal and ethical questions this situation raises, because they're fascinating and complex. Legal question 1, is this protected speech? As I mentioned earlier, the First Amendment protects a tremendous amount of speech, including speech that many people find offensive or even dangerous. The Supreme Court has consistently held that the government cannot restrict speech based on its content unless it falls into very narrow categories: true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action, defamation, obscenity, and a few others. So where does this commentator's statement fall? If the statement was a genuine threat, meaning a serious expression of intent to commit an act of unlawful violence against a particular individual or group, it would not be protected. The Supreme Court has defined true threats as statements where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence. But here's where it gets tricky. If the commentator was calling for government action rather than threatening personal violence, that might be political advocacy rather than a threat. Advocating for government policies, even aggressive ones, is generally protected speech. However, if the statement could be reasonably interpreted as inciting imminent lawless action, that's a different story. Under Brandenburg versus Ohio, speech loses First Amendment protection if it's intended to incite imminent lawless action and is likely to do so. The key word there is imminent. The threat has to be immediate, not speculative or future-oriented. Legal scholars could debate this for hours, and they probably will. The point is, it's complicated, and context matters enormously. Legal question 2, platform responsibility. Even if the statement is legally protected, meaning the government can't punish it, private platforms have their own rules and standards. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media companies are not bound by the First Amendment. They're private entities that can set and enforce their own terms of service. The question is, should they? If a statement violates platform policies against threats or incitement, should the platform remove it? Should they suspend or ban the user? Or should they err on the side of allowing more speech, even controversial speech, and let users decide for themselves what to believe? This is one of the defining debates of our time. How do we balance free expression with platform safety? How do we prevent the spread of genuinely dangerous content without creating an Orwellian system of censorship? There are no easy answers, but the stakes are incredibly high. Here's something I think about a lot. With great platform comes great responsibility. When you have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers, your words carry weight. You have the ability to influence public opinion, to shape narratives, to mobilize people to action. That's power, real power. And with that power comes, or should come, a sense of responsibility. Not legal obligation necessarily, but ethical responsibility. If you're a public figure with a large platform, do you have a duty to be careful with your words, to consider how they might be interpreted, to avoid language that could reasonably be seen as threatening or inciting violence? I would argue yes, not because the government should force you to, but because it's the right thing to do. We can have passionate political disagreements. We can advocate forcefully for our beliefs, but we can do so without resorting to threats, without dehumanizing our opponents, without contributing to a climate of fear and intimidation. Ethical question 2, the audience's role. But it's not just on the influencers. We, as audience members, as consumers of content, also have a role to play. Are we rewarding extreme rhetoric with clicks, likes, and shares? Are we creating an incentive structure where the most outrageous, inflammatory content gets the most attention? If so, we're part of the problem. We need to be more thoughtful about what content we engage with, what we amplify, what we reward with our attention. We need to support voices that elevate the discourse rather than degrade it. This isn't about silencing anyone or creating echo chambers. It's about consciously choosing to engage with content that is substantive, thoughtful, and respectful, even when it's challenging our beliefs. All right, let's zoom out and look at the really big picture here, because this incident, as significant as it is just one data point in a larger trend that should concern all of us. The polarization crisis. America is more politically polarized than at any point in modern history. Studies by the Pew Research Center show that the gap between Republicans and Democrats on fundamental political values has grown exponentially over the past 2 decades. But it's not just that we disagree on policy. We increasingly view members of the other party as threats to the nation itself. A 2022 survey found that more than 40% of both Republicans and Democrats view the opposing party as downright evil. Not wrong, not misguided, evil. When you see your political opponents as evil, compromise becomes impossible, dialogue becomes pointless, and violence becomes, in the minds of some, justified. This is the environment in which incidents like this commentator's statement occur. It's not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much deeper disease, the erosion of democratic norms. Democratic societies function on a foundation of shared norms and mutual respect. We don't have to agree, but we have to agree on the rules of engagement. We have to accept that our opponents have legitimate concerns, that they have the right to organize and advocate for their beliefs, that elections have consequences, and that we'll have another chance to make our case in the next election. But those norms are eroding. We've seen elected officials refuse to accept election results without evidence of fraud. We've seen calls to imprison political opponents. We've seen violence at political events. We've seen the Supreme Court become a political football rather than an independent arbiter of constitutional questions. Each of these things individually might not seem catastrophic, but together they represent a weakening of the institutional and cultural foundations that make democracy possible. The international dimension. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The world is watching. America has long positioned itself as the leader of the free world, a beacon of democracy and human rights. But our allies and our adversaries alike are watching how we handle our internal divisions. When they see political violence, when they see threats against citizens exercising their constitutional rights, when they see the normalization of extreme rhetoric, what conclusions do they draw? Our adversaries use it as propaganda, pointing to American instability to justify their own authoritarian systems. Look at the chaos of democracy, they say. Look at how weak and divided they are. Our allies worry about whether we can be relied upon, whether we'll be there when they need us, or whether we'll be too consumed by our own internal conflicts to play a leadership role on the world stage. This matters. American credibility, American soft power, American leadership, these aren't abstract concepts. They have real-world implications for global stability, for trade, for security alliances, for the balance of power between democracies and autocracies. The path forward, what can we do? So what's the solution? How do we pull back from the brink? There's no single answer, no magic bullet. But there are things we can do, both individually and collectively. Reject political violence and threats in all forms. It doesn't matter if it's our side or their side. Violence and threats are unacceptable. Full stop. Engage in good faith. Assume that most people, even those you disagree with profoundly, are acting from genuinely held beliefs and concerns. Don't attribute to malice what can be explained by different values or priorities. Support institutional reforms that reduce polarization and incentivize cooperation. This might include things like ranked choice voting, independent redistricting commissions, campaign finance reform, and changes to primary election systems. Consume media critically. Don't just accept narratives that confirm your existing beliefs. Seek out diverse perspectives. Fact check. Be skeptical of extreme claims from any source. Participate actively in democracy. Vote, volunteer, attend local meetings, run for office. Democracy doesn't happen on autopilot. It requires engaged citizens. Have conversations across the divide. This is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Find opportunities to talk with people who see the world differently than you do. Listen more than you talk. Try to understand, not just to win the argument. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about what happened, why it matters, the legal and ethical dimensions, the historical context, and the broader implications for democracy. Now, I want to pose a question to you, and I really want you to think about this. What kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country where political disagreements are settled through dialogue, persuasion, and the democratic process? Or do we want to be a country where might makes right? Where the loudest voice or the biggest threat wins? Do we want to be a country that upholds constitutional rights for everyone, even people we disagree with? Or do we want rights to be conditional, subject to the political winds of the moment? Do we want to be a country where public figures can make threats against citizens exercising their rights without consequence? Or do we want to hold ourselves and our leaders to a higher standard? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're fundamental questions about American identity and values, and how we answer them, not just in words, but in our actions, in the leaders we support, in the content we consume and share, will determine the future of this country. Here's what I believe. We're at a crossroads. We can continue down the path of escalating rhetoric, deepening polarization, and normalizing threats and violence. If we do, I genuinely fear for the future of American democracy. History shows us where this path leads, and it's nowhere good. Or we can choose a different path. We can choose to pull back from the brink. We can choose dialogue over demonization. We can choose to defend the rights of all Americans, not just the ones we agree with. We can choose to build rather than destroy. But here's the thing, that second path is harder. It requires discipline. It requires us to resist our worst impulses, to reject the dopamine hit of outrage and self-righteousness. It requires us to do the hard work of democracy. I think we're up to it. I think Americans, when we're at our best, are capable of incredible things. We've overcome challenges before. Civil War, depression, world wars, civil rights struggles. We've made progress, often halting and incomplete, but progress nonetheless. We can do it again, but only if we choose to. So here's what I want you to do. First, think about what you just heard. Don't just react emotionally. Sit with it. Consider the different perspectives. Ask yourself what you believe and why you believe it. Second, get informed. Don't rely on any single source, including me, for your information. Read widely, seek out perspectives that challenge your assumptions. Develop your own informed opinion based on evidence and reasoning, not just tribal loyalty. Third, engage. Talk to people. Share this video if you think it's valuable. Comment below with your thoughts. I genuinely want to hear from you, whether you agree or disagree. Civil discourse is how we move forward. Fourth, participate in democracy. Register to vote if you're not already registered. Learn about the issues and the candidates. Show up. Your voice matters, but only if you use it. And finally, hold yourself and others to a higher standard. When you see threats, when you see dehumanizing language, when you see the normalization of violence, call it out. Don't participate in it. Don't amplify it. Be better. This incident with the commentator and the gun owners heading to D.C., it's not just a news story. It's a test. It's a test of whether we, as Americans, still believe in the principles this country was founded on. The right to free speech, the right to bear arms, the right to peacefully assemble, the right to petition our government. These rights belong to everyone, or they belong to no one. So what's it going to be? If this video made you think, if it challenged you, if it gave you a new perspective, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos breaking down the most important legal and political issues of our time. And drop a comment below. Seriously, I want to know what you think about all this. We're living through history right now. The decisions we make, the standards we uphold, the leaders we support, these will echo for generations. Let's make sure we get it right. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.